Hello, everybody. My name is Ty Bernicke, and I'm going to be talking with you about lowering taxes in retirement with some different effective tax minimization strategies. And when you're tax planning for retirement, it's really important to look at the collective total of all the different income sources that you might have in retirement, including pension income, Social Security income. If you're going to be working part-time or if you still have business ownership interest, that will factor into play. And of course, investments have tax implications as well. So the first thing that I wanted to start off by going over is to help you understand a few variables that will affect the strategies that we're going to be talking about in a little bit. So imagine for a second if you had to take all the investments that you own and that people in the general public own, and you had to place them into three different buckets. The first one we'll call the Tax Deferred Bucket, which will include things like IRAs, 401ks, 403bs, 457b plans. Many of you won't have all of these types of plans, but you might have one or a few of them. Now, when you put money into this bucket, it gets put in on a pre-tax or a tax-deductible basis, which means it saves you money in taxes in the year you put money into that bucket. The money grows on a tax-deferred basis, and when you pull it out, generally speaking, 100% of that money, when you're withdrawing it in retirement to supplement your income, it's going to be subject to income tax. If you take it out for qualified reasons, if you take it out for unqualified reasons, you might even have to pay a penalty on top of that. And you will have to take money out of this at some point. Depending on your date of birth, you might have to start taking money out at age 73 or as late as age 75, because eventually the government wants to get some of the taxes that they haven't got from this bucket at some point in time. That's why you have those required minimum distributions. The second bucket is what we call the tax-free bucket, which could include things like Roth IRAs, Roth 401ks, Roth 403bs, or Roth 457bs. Again, many of you won't have all of those different categories of investments that you can place your money into, but some of you might have one or two. Now, when you put money into this bucket, generally it doesn't give you any immediate tax relief or significant tax relief at the onset, but in this bucket, money grows tax-free, and if you take it out for qualified reasons, it can be withdrawn income tax-free. You can even leave it to your beneficiaries who can also withdraw that money income tax-free. So once the money's in there, it's permanently protected from taxes, but you don't get any tax benefit up front like you do with that tax deferred bucket. The final bucket is what we call the non-qualified bucket. And depending on the types of investments that you own in this bucket, those investments can be taxed differently. If you own stocks or mutual funds that invest in stocks, chances are you will have annual dividends and you might have gains distributions, or when you sell those securities, you might have a taxable capital gain. Fortunately, the tax rates on those are more attractive than ordinary income tax rates. If you own municipal bonds, you might not have to pay federal, or you won't have to pay federal tax, and depending on the state you reside, you might not have to pay any state income tax on those municipal bonds either. So they can be quite tax efficient, but they do create other tax complications that can make them less effective, and the interest rates typically aren't as competitive as other types of bonds. If you do own corporate bonds or government bonds, they're fully subject to ordinary income tax rates. And so they tend to be very tax inefficient when owned in this bucket. Actively managed mutual funds can be very tax inefficient in this bucket when owned in this bucket. Balanced mutual funds that have a mixture of stocks and bonds can be very tax inefficient to own in this bucket as well. And there actually is something that you can find through a company called Morningstar that discloses the tax cost ratio of certain types of investments. And it's not uncommon to see many mutual funds that have a tax cost ratio of 1.5%. 1.5% essentially means that if you made 8% before tax, after taxes, you would only make 6.5%, because 1.5% of that is going to pay the tax man at the end of the year. So that's what the tax cost ratio does, is it essentially reduces your rate of return. In this example, I made this to help illustrate over the course of retirement how important it is to keep that tax cost ratio at a reasonable level. And in this example, assuming we started with a $500,000 investment that had a 1.5% tax cost ratio, assuming that investment grew at 8% for 30 years, this is the amount of money that you would have. If you simply did a different investment that grew at the same rate, that had a slightly lower tax cost ratio, you can see it makes a big difference in the bottom line to the tune of $700,000 over a 30-year time horizon. So again, I wanted to help illustrate why it is so important to own the right types of investments in the non-qualified bucket. It can have a very meaningful impact over the course of your retirement. So that's one of the strategies I wanted to go over. A real low tax cost ratio is about 0.3%. A very high tax cost ratio on the very high side would be 5%. So you'd literally be giving up 5% of your gains each year to taxes if you're in a higher tax bracket and you had a very tax inefficient investment in that non-qualified bucket. The second strategy that I want to go over with you is the most lost opportunities that we see in our office have to do with people not placing the right types of investments in the right buckets. So we're going to talk a little bit about this, but when you think of these different buckets and you ask yourself, well, which of these three would I want to have the most amount of money in 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road? Everybody is going to pick the tax-free bucket because you can spend 100% of the distributions that are taken out of that bucket for qualified reasons. This tax-deferred bucket, generally speaking, 100% of what is withdrawn is going to be subject to income taxes. So if you could have a million here or a million here, it's much better to have a million here for all the obvious reasons. Like we just mentioned with the non-qualified bucket, there's certain types of investments you just want to avoid over here because they're very tax inefficient when owned in that area. But some of those investments, they might be good investments and you can always place them in a different bucket. But generally, we try to stifle the growth of this bucket by putting our more conservative investments like bonds in this bucket, which we assume won't grow as much over time. And our growth-oriented investments like stocks, we are more likely to put that into this tax-free bucket if we don't need to spend that money for a period of time. And because if we have time on our side, stocks historically have done well over longer periods of time relative to bonds. And so generally speaking, we want to promote more growth here. We want to stifle growth here. And there's just certain investments we want to avoid here. But this makes such a big difference as it pertains to how much money you'll have over time. And I wanted to try to illustrate an example to help you understand how significant this is. And I realize this is a lot in front of you, so I'm going to do my best to explain what all this means. Let's just, for this example, we've got a husband and wife, 59 and 57 years old. Let's assume that they make 8% per year on their stock and growth accounts, and 3% on their bonds, and 2% on municipal bonds. And we'll also assume that they'll have to take those required minimum distributions out at age 73 in this example. And we assume that these people are in the top of the 12% tax bracket. It assumes that the Trump tax rates expire, and it also assumes that once they start taking those required minimum distributions at 73, that's an added source of income which will actually push them into a higher tax bracket. And for this example, we'll assume this married couple has $1 million over in the tax-deferred bucket, $300,000 in the tax-free, $500,000 in the non-qualified bucket. And we're going to take a look at what the recommendations will be, but essentially we're going to talk about, again, lowering the tax cost ratio over here and increasing stocks here and decreasing stocks here and increasing bonds here, because the bonds, again, we should grow at a lower rate like we used in this assumption over time if history tends to repeat itself. So again, Here's the current portfolio of their different buckets. So for the tax deferred bucket, they currently are in a 75-25 split between stocks and bonds. Right now, they're at a 50-50 split for the tax-free and an 80-20 split in the taxable bucket. And if you look at this, based on all of those numbers, this is the split between stocks and bonds collectively when you do the math. 72% stocks, 28% bonds. Now, watch what happens when we just change a few things. We increase the amount of bonds in the tax-deferred bucket. We decrease the bonds to nothing in that tax-free bucket. And then we also do the same in the taxable bucket. When we do the math on this and look at the amounts that were owned in these different buckets, and then we change the allocations to what I just mentioned here by reducing bonds in these two buckets, increasing bonds in the tax-deferred bucket, and decreasing that tax cost ratio, we still overall have the exact same allocation between stocks and bonds. So risk tolerance wise, it's still the same as it was, identical. However, by making this change, look at what a big difference it makes from a tax perspective over time. The added value from making those changes is over 1.8 million during a 30-year retirement time horizon. So again, location optimization can make a big difference in how big of a nest egg you can leave to the next generation. And it can also make a big difference on how much income that you can spend throughout retirement. If you do have any questions on anything I went over today, or if you'd like to schedule a quick 15-minute call, click the link in the description or visit our website at www.bernicke.com. Thank you.